What's the dumbest thing you have ever believed? When I was small, I lived in a small town by an oil refinery. My parents convinced me that if you fart on sight, it would explode. I was in kindergarten. We went on a class field trip there once, not much else to do in the middle of nowhere, and I felt the gas building in my gut. I didn't want to kill everyone, so I grew quite stressed. I realized that I would need to take extraordinary measures to prevent catastrophe, so I spent an embarrassingly long amount of time with my hand down my pants, blocking my fart. When I was a kid, I used to think girls had different colored rings around their nipples, eye colors like brown, blue, and green. I thought that boobs were perfectly round with scented nipples, like headlights. I was absolutely appalled the first time I saw adult boobs. I got over it, though. For the longest time when I was young, I believed getting new training shoes made you run faster. As soon as I got a new pair, I'd go outside and have my distance set between two lamp posts. I'd swear it felt like I was quicker with every new pair. When I was young, I didn't realize that the car indicator was manually controlled by the driver. I thought the car just knew where you wanted to go. A lot of drivers around here still believe that one. When I was like 5 or 4, I strongly believed that it wasn't people growing up that caused their clothes not to fit in anymore, but it was clothes becoming smaller and tighter by themselves. I planned to keep a piece of my clothing and see how small it could get and whether or not it would vanish at the end. Well, we do say that shirt's getting too small for you instead of you're getting too big for that shirt. Great story. That the moon or sun follows me every time I'm in the car. When I was little. When I was really little, I really thought the world was in black and white and suddenly became color at some point. I knew that the actors on TV were real people, so they must have lived back when the world was gray. This was backed up by evidence of black and white photos in the family album that also then turned to color photos as people got older. That Robin Williams and Robbie Williams were one and the same person. He'd wear his old man mask when he was acting for a movie, and his normal version is the musician. Might have gotten confused after watching Mrs. Doubtfire as a kid. Believed this far longer than I'm willing to admit. When I first learned what sex was, I didn't realize people did it for fun. I thought it was just a very clinical, boring thing people did when they wanted children. So yeah, there's that. Offshoot story. When I explained baby making to my daughter, I remember stressing that it's a grown-up thing to do. Not too long after, she somehow heard about teenage pregnancy and asked me why the teenagers were doing the baby making if they didn't want a baby. And that's how I got boxed into explaining the recreational side of sex to my 5-year-old. Not me, but my friend. He believes, still to this day, that all bus stops are sanctuaries and that you can commit any crime and not be charged, as long as you are in the confines of the bus stop. Mind you, we are both 27. I have no idea where he got this from, but when pressed about it, his answer is always this: dude, that's why you see so many people at bus stops shooting up heroin and smoking crack meth. They can't get in trouble there, and if they OD, the ambulance knows right where to go. To which my response is, you're an idiot. Drugs aside, what if someone murders someone else at a bus stop? Are they still free to leave? Him, dude, I'm not gonna argue semantics over this. Just look it the up. Google it. Bus stops are sanctuaries. Then Googling it only reaffirms his belief, because there's not some very specific web page that explicitly says that crimes are still crimes at a bus stop. See man, I told you. If I was wrong, it would be on the front page of Google. I refuse to believe your friend isn't with you. If you swallowed watermelon seeds, they'd grow in your stomach. My brother and his friend said that to me once while eating watermelons. Me, being very young at the time, believed them and got scared because I swallowed some seeds. For about a year after, I thought that my testicles were watermelons growing inside me. My dad drove over Rumble Strip when I was young, and I asked what they were for, and he said so blind drivers know that a stop sign is coming up, and I believed that for like 4 straight years until it finally clicked. That when they had an ad for an upcoming sport event, the footage they showed was from the future. For some reason I thought all TV was live, so that meant that previews were from the future. I blame having older brothers. There was a lighty-uppy fountain near where I lived when I was a kid. The lights changed color and everything. It was pretty awesome for a kid. My dad told me that a tiny little man was sitting in a tiny little room under the fountain, and he just sat there switching lights on and off. I believed him for years. Edited to add that my dad will be thrilled to know that his bullshittery got gilded. Thank you. That several meant 7. I thought a few meant 13. My grandpa had given me a few sunflower seeds, so I counted them so I would know how many a few was. Later I couldn't understand why my mom got so mad at me for taking 13 cookies when she said I could have a few. Putting batteries in a flashlight backwards sucks light. Thanks grandpa, you got me. Came to find out he got my dad with that one also when he was young. When you have sex, the guy puts his thing between the girl's tits and somehow sex happens. I only realized I was wrong when in 6th grade science it didn't make sense fish could do this underwater. This same day I became a man. I hate to point out the obvious, but another nail in the coffin of this idea is that fish don't have tits. I believed women did not have belly buttons till I was 4 or so. I was raised in rural Mississippi. Born in 1966. Very conservative culture. I had only seen my mom's body. I'd taken baths with her when I was a wee lad. My mom was overweight, and as far as I had seen, she did not have a belly button. Therefore, women did not have belly buttons. That stoplights changed colors when I said please and thank you. I used to think that actors were there waiting to perform movies, shows every time I wanted to watch it. I always wondered how they got it perfect every time and were always available every time I popped in my favorite VHS tape. Sometimes I'd watch closer, hoping to catch an imperfection. My sister told me when I was really young that if I used girl shampoo or shower gel I would turn into a girl. I believed her until I was 14 because I just assumed she would never lie to me, which is also a dumb thing to believe. That in the old movies when someone was killed, they actually died. My sister explained to me that people used to volunteer to die so the film could be made. Batman was named Batman because he was raised by bats. And that cats actually had 9 lives, so if you tried to kill a cat it would literally die then come back to life and go about its daily routine until all lives are wasted. Believed all this shit during up until my teens. Back in college, I read this article about a South American tribe that had made complex computers using a rope pulley system. I excitedly told some people about it, thinking it was really cool. Only later did I realize that the tribe's name was a pun on April Fools. I felt like the biggest idiot around for believing it. This just reminded me, I once turned on the TV as a teen and saw a documentary about space was running, so I kept watching. They were talking about SETI and how we send messages to space. Then they mentioned how we once detected a signal that was kind of suspicious and how they investigated it. They ended up decoding it and found that it was very obviously of extraterrestrial nature. They interviewed researchers who speculated the possible meaning behind it. It was all very serious and down to earth. I was super excited and couldn't believe how I hadn't heard of this before. Then the voice went, the events of this documentary did not actually happen. But what if something like this would happen? How would we react? How would it impact our lives? I wanted to punch the TV so hard. I once believed that the color green was good for your eyes. So one time I sat in my room and stared at green construction paper for 45 minutes. Was probably 10. Definitely old enough to know better. My grandma used to live on the top floor of her apartment when I was like 4 or 5, and for me to stop jumping she would tell me that people live underneath. Somehow in my mind that meant tiny people lived under her couch and chair and I would try to talk to them a lot. I fully believed adults couldn't run. It was always children running around but adults would just walk. I formed my own conclusion and stuck by that for years. This will take a little bit of explaining. Back when I was a kid, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street were broadcast one after the other on PBS. The former show, in case you don't remember, would always start off with Mr. Rogers speaking and singing to the camera, after which a toy trolley would go through a little hole in the wall, into the neighborhood of make-believe. This was not, as I eventually came to understand, a physical place that happened to be located in Mr. Rogers' backyard, but rather a magical realm that could only be reached via that aforementioned tunnel. Now, let's pause there for a moment. and turn our attention to Sesame Street. One of the mainstay characters in residence on Sesame Street, which was a physical location in the real world, at least as far as I was able to tell, was Oscar the Grouch, who lived in a metal garbage can just outside of an apartment building. While that choice of dwelling always seemed questionable to me, the thing that really left me scratching my head was the fact that the green-furred Muppet apparently had a herd of elephants living in there with him. These pachyderms were never seen save for on rare occasions when they'd reach their trunks out of the garbage can and trumpet about one thing or another, but they nonetheless had every appearance of being quite content to stay in what should have been far too small a space for them, on their own. These two details, the existence of a magical realm in Mr. Rogers' wall and the fact that Oscar the Grouch somehow kept enormous pets in his home, really shouldn't have been the grounds for any kind of ridiculous theories. But I managed to combine them after a particularly memorable episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, during which Big Bird paid a visit to the neighborhood of make-believe. It suggested that the two shows took place in the same universe, which suggested in turn that the real world in which Sesame Street was located, remember, was connected to the magical one via other passageways than the one through which Mr. Rogers' trolley would travel. After all, I couldn't imagine an 8-foot-tall fowl crawling through that tiny tunnel. As you can imagine, this realization prompted me to start questioning where the other portals might be located, and that was when it dawned on me. There was no possible way that Oscar the Grouch could keep elephants in his garbage can unless that same garbage can was secretly a portal to a much larger space. That space, as became obvious, was actually the neighborhood of make-believe, and Big Bird had somehow bribed Sesame Street's most cantankerous resident for the privilege of traveling between the two realms. This was how I became convinced, if only for a brief period, that there were adventures waiting to be had just beneath the lids of any refuse containers that I might encounter in the real world. Sadly, after the first time that they found the 4-year-old trying to burrow into a trash can, my parents told me that I wasn't allowed to embark on those journeys until I was an adult. Still, maybe those are my next vacation's plans sorted. This is not my story, but my sister thought all the panthers were pink because of the Pink Panther cartoon. She believed in it until 10 years old. Then the show would have just been called Panther. I thought men gave birth to dogs. I have been a die-hard fan of Teletubbies until 5 years old. You know those moments when they showed some videos of kids doing stuff on their tummy TVs? Well, I used to believe that the kids were real beings inside the Teletubbies and that basically the whole universe we live in was situated in the tummy of a Teletubby. I sometimes think back about that. I cringe a little and say to myself, boy, I was an idiot. That a carpool weren't many people sharing a car ride. Didn't know that when I was a kid in the 1980s. But a very small pool in a very large car, a literal car pool. If you swallow gum, it stays in your digestion system for 7 years, and if you swallow watermelon seeds, your stomach will grow a watermelon. Joke's on you, I still ate the watermelon seeds. I thought that ancient Rome and the Renaissance were the same time period. To be fair, the people running the Renaissance often tried to give that exact impression. When I was a kid, I used to believe that all cats are females and all dogs are males. Kinda made sense back then. I was a solidly grown-ass adult before it came to my attention that narwhals are actual animals and not mythical creatures. My mom used to tell me if I cut my fingernails at night, ghost will appear. So one day, feeling daring, I did just that. I was disappointed. Why would she tell you this? That I needed to take my dress off to pee. Turns out I could just lift it up. Little kid logic. The boy version of this was the kid who always dropped his pants to his ankles to pee. Every grade school had one of these kids. Come to think of it, I've seen this more than once out at bars. I think the reasons might be slightly different though. I was little and in the car with my mom, and I asked what this was. She told me it was in case a deer or something was in the road. So, I assumed all cars were equipped with a gun that, with the push of a button, could kill anything that got in our way. As an animal lover, I hoped we'd never have to use it. Growing up with undiagnosed Asperger's, it wasn't until secondary school that it really clicked for me that other people have internal lives the same way I do. Up until that point, I'd basically considered myself to be in a world of NPCs, so it was quite a wake-up call. When I was a child I used to think that there's another world behind the TV screen. News reporters, cartoons or anything that appears on screen is living inside the TV box.